Like, that is a disgusting colour, right? But
that's vomit brown.
exactly. No, but it's saying I've changed my picture too many times and it won't let me change it again.
You'll have to wait now. Is there a timer on it?
There's no timer. I just wanted to change it again. I didn't know whether there was a
you
thing I
stuck
could do.
you stuck with the turd colour.
No, I don't want it.
Can I leave that? Are you still recording this? Because this will be a hell of a conversation for viewers.
I am indeed. Actually, that's a point. I can turn it off now.
Don't edit that last part out.
That's the intro slide. Why is my background a third colour?
Welcome this evening. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for coming. This is data protection and GDPR with my good self. And the General Data Protection Regulation came into effect on the 25th of May 2 years ago. So it's not particularly old, although prior to that, for between 3 and 5 years, it was in development. And so companies were panicking left, right and centre to make sure that they were compliant, and many of them still aren't. It quickly caught out over 200,000 businesses in its first 12 months, and there were fines totaling 56 million euros, and 50 million of that was paid by Google on their own. So in this presentation I'll summarise the legislation for you, and I'll give you my top tips and best practices to make sure that you know what's required to stay compliant. Bear in mind this is, as I say, a module for another course that I'm doing, so as I'm going through it I might be speaking to you as if you were a business or a small business owner yourself. It's really good to know. You may well need to know what this is as you go through your careers. It's an unavoidable thing, particularly now that data protection is really important now. What we'll do is, after I've given you my tips, we'll go through what the general data protection is, and we'll finish up on a couple of case studies, look at the attacker perspective, and then have a chat about what's going to happen with GDPR after Brexit. So, what is GDPR? So, as you guys probably know, it's a European law that governs what companies and organisations are allowed to do with your personal data. So it was introduced because the previous Data Protection Act was actually created back in the 90s, 1995 if I remember correctly. So that's about 25 years ago. And of course that was before we all had smartphones capable of collecting massive amounts of sensitive information about us. And companies like Google and Facebook since then have been able to collect this data, or big data as it's known, and profit from its use, mostly by engaging in targeted marketing or selling to third parties that can do the same thing. I'm not going to go into much detail in this, but this is quite a handy resource and I'll make it available to you on the drive, guys, if anyone needs to check in with it. But this is sort of GDPR in a nutshell. Lawful basis, individuals' rights, accountability, protects personal data and data protection principles, and then in each of those boxes there's each of the main topics in each of those little bubbles. So it's a really good reference, that, and it sums up GDPR, what it's about, and just breaks it up into those 5 sections. So moving on, data breaches. So you've all heard of data breaches, I'm sure, and it's basically the intentional or unintentional release of secure or private or confidential information to an untrusted environment. And other terms for this phenomenon include unintentional information disclosure, data leak, information leakage, or data spill. And personal data is defined as any piece of information that can be used either on its own or with another piece of information to determine the identity of an individual. So the storage of data needs to be justified. So if a good reason for having it can't be provided, it could mean facing tough financial penalties. And failure to comply with GDPR can cost the business up to 4% of its annual turnover, or up to 20 million euros, whichever's highest. So it can be hugely costly for non-compliance. But there are two tiers of the penalty. Lower tier is either a fine of up to 2% of annual turnover or 10 million euros, so half. And again, it's whichever's highest. And the level of penalty is decided by the governing body or of the country that the organisation is registered in. So next we're going to go through top 10 best practices and how they should be part of an organisation's policies. And that's really just to help them mitigate the risk of data leakage and hopefully prevent an expensive breach. First tip for avoiding a fine is make sure that any data stored is well organised, and it needs to be readily available as well if someone asks for it. Whether that be an individual or a business or an auditor, it must be quickly and accurately available on request, and a valid explanation and reason for storing it must be provided. Secondly, as part of an organisation's housekeeping, it's a good idea to regularly delete any information that's already served its purpose, and make sure that no data is kept unnecessarily and without its owner's consent. So if you've got no reason for having that information, it really needs to go. So thirdly, the GDPR dictates that data is stored securely and protected against unauthorised access. So ensuring data is physically secure and any servers are under lock and key is crucial, as well as all hard copies need to be kept in a fireproof safe that can only be accessible to authorised personnel. So only people who've got permission to access that safe should be able to do so. Data needs to be protected from remote access, so antivirus software, of course, firewalls, and all devices, all softwares need to be up to date. Measures really need to be put in place to stop malicious hackers from gaining access and compromising important business critical systems. Up next is risk assessment. So it's a good idea to create a risk assessment and a record of security measures that can be rolled out to all staff. And this can be used to demonstrate the business's best practices for data protection should an auditor come to visit. And if you demonstrate a reasonable effort to protect your sensitive data that you control, this will often work in your favour in the event that you do have a breach and you end up in court. 6 on the list is privacy policy. So creating a clear and fair processing policy or privacy policy that explains to people what data is being collected, why it's being collected, how it will be used by the organisation, and who it will be shared with is a really good idea. The GDPR requires that this contains no confusing jargon, so it needs to be clear, concise and comprehensive, and this again will show transparency and demonstrate sound business practice. So you're also required to be transparent with people's personal data, and that gives control of that data back to the individual that it belongs to. And that really means that if a business has any data of its suppliers or customers or even staff, it must be stored securely and be readily available on request. And in the event that any stored information is requested, there must be a response within 1 month, and it must be delivered accurately, in full and free of charge. So it's a good idea to create a process for this, and also a process for actually deleting the data when it's also requested. Number 8 on the list is marketing consent. When GDPR first came into force, consent to use data for marketing was changed from opt-out to opt-in. And I don't know if many of you remember, but if you ever downloaded any software or if you did a terms and conditions or an agreement, you had to basically opt out so that you didn't get all the spam and emails and marketing stuff into your email. And that's now changed, or it did change, from opt-out to opt-in. It's advisable to have a clear and positive opt-out policy, and that needs to be kept as evidence with the rest of any stored data. If someone opts out again, then again it's really important that a rigorous and thorough process to ensure they don't receive anything from that moment on comes into play. And failing to do that is a really easy way to get caught out by complaints and later be fined. Number 9, we've got data protection officer. So appointing a DPO is advisable for any business, and that's going to be someone who will be responsible for implementing the processes and policies I've just gone through. And initially it's a good idea for senior management to take on the role and then delegate these responsibilities once a thorough and complete understanding of how to stay GDPR compliant is gained. And number 10, incident management. Every organisation is responsible for implementing an incident management system, and part of that will involve the designated DPO being responsible for reporting an incident to the governing body who enforces data protection in that country. And in the UK, that's the Information Commissioner's Office, or ICO, and that needs to be done within 72 hours of discovering the breach. Okie dokie, so next we'll just have a quick look at a couple of case studies, starting with British Airways. Did anybody hear about this breach?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. So obviously it was a massive one. It was the biggest fine to date. What happened was the systems were successfully attacked and infiltrated and then modified to steal any of the new details and entries that were added to the database. And it wasn't until 2 months later that BA was made aware of the breach and actually notified the ICO. And the ICO took a look at it and then issued them with the largest GDPR fine to date, which was a whopping £183 million. Anyway, they contested it, and after 2 long years in the courts, they managed to whittle that down to about 20 million. And I think that was finalised about a month ago now. And it was ruled that they failed to implement adequate security measures to protect the login details. So they had names, addresses of 9 million customers, including the payment card numbers of around 2,000 of them. Excuse me. The second case study is the Marriott. And I actually used to work for the Marriott many moons ago. But what happened with this one is a smaller company called Starwood Hotels was bought by Marriott after it had fallen victim of a cyber attack 2 years before the acquisition actually took place. And it was really a lack of due diligence on the part of Marriott that meant that the attacker remained on the system and they were able to access the personal details of 339 million guests, including names, email addresses, phone numbers, their arrival and departure details. They even had the membership type and the status of the membership, so it was quite a thorough fleecing. And the ICO ended up finding them 18.4 million for failing to protect customers' details. So some big fines there. Somebody at the door. Okie dokie, so just a quick look at what the attacker can do, or what they strive to do. They want unauthorised access to data systems, obviously. They'll create backdoors that can be exploited, as in the second case there where they were sat in the system for a long time. It can be years they'll sit there before they actually get what they're after or make themselves known. They'll try and modify systems to capture data as well, and the whole point is to sell sensitive personal information and make money out of that any way they can. So, what the future holds. The official GDPR legislation site is well worth a visit to familiarise yourself with the regulation, and it'll help you understand what's required to stay compliant. But as I mentioned earlier, December 31st marks the end of the Brexit transition period, and our own Data Protection Act of 2018, which ran alongside GDPR, will effectively become the new UK GDPR, which is essentially the same, but with a few additional clauses. And most of those are minor, but leaving Europe will mean that in effect we'll become known as a third country, a bit like a third party. And then the EU will certainly hold the UK under much greater scrutiny, as I'm sure they'd like nothing more than to catch it out with their own legislation. But for some time after the transition period, there'll be nothing to worry about, although as more trade deals and trade agreements are made with other countries outside of the EU, more and more clauses will start to muddy the waters, and our UK GDPR will start to have little gaps in it and loopholes, I imagine, that will be easy to exploit. Most recently, it's been highlighted with our new trade agreement with Japan, and they have a free data flow policy with the US, and so there's growing concerns that our personal data might find itself inadvertently in American hands, and as we know, the Americans love to fleece their citizens and data mine the crap out of them, so hopefully that won't happen.
To be fair, I'd be surprised if I don't know about data already.
Yeah, I mean, there's a good chance. They'll have a certain amount. But if it gets over there through legal loopholes, then, you know, we don't really have a leg to stand on.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
That's it, guys. That's everything. Just a quick summary of what we've gone through. So we've just gone through the GDPR, penalties for non-compliance. You should know what data breaches are anyway. There's 10 best practices there for compliance, and a couple of case studies, and what attackers do and what we're hopefully looking forward to going forward. Any questions?
You're talking about the British Airways data breach those years ago. I can't remember exactly what I read about it in relation to the black box, but I believe, I don't know if it's British Airways or another airline company, got slated for this. Their black box information was that planes were that old that they still use floppy disks to put the information on, and then they transferred it from the plane to wherever they needed. But yeah, it's all on floppy disks.
Yeah, it sounds like it probably will be BA, because I think they have slightly, or at least part of their fleet was slightly older. But I know EasyJet, when lockdown first started, EasyJet got fleeced as well. They had a big data breach. So there was obviously something going on where airlines were obviously high priority and high target when they were grounded. So yeah, and you can see why as well. I mean, again, it's down to the pandemic and criminals, whether it was nation state or individuals acting, they'll always capitalise on something like a pandemic when there's chaos, when there's an issue, so that, you know, when the attention's not turned at normal operation, then there's a good chance that things will get missed or overlooked, and they can make a lot more money out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I will point out one thing. No, you covered everything. You covered everything. It was perfect. One thing you didn't. I don't know if I might misread this, but when it comes to GDPR, one of the loopholes in businesses was global businesses like Google and Microsoft and all that sort of thing were transferring personal information around the world through the business network and not telling the clients where this information was being stored, because obviously everyone knows different countries have different laws around personal information. Yeah. So personal information going to different countries through the same company, you must get expressed permission from the person before you can even think about transferring it to a different country.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely right. This again is why it's always an issue when different countries are having or do have different policies with regards to data. And as I say, with Japan, they're a very trusting race, and they have a specific political agenda to make data freely available, which obviously is the opposite to people like to governments like in the EU and ourselves to a certain extent.
Yeah, absolutely.
So whether it's because we've got more to hide, I don't know, but it's certainly a concern.
Yeah.